It's 11:30. Let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Watershed University. Welcome to today's Watershed University webinar. These webinars are hosted by the California Silver Jackets Collaborative Program for Flood Risk. The Silver Jackets, they are commonly known, is a partnership between the Army Corps of Engineers and the Department of Water Resources. My name is Samson Haile Selassie. I work with the Department of Water Resources, and I'm the State Deputy Lead for the Silver Jackets. We'll hear more on the Silver Jackets later on today in the first presentation of the webinar. So the webinar series that we are starting today are targeted at anyone interested in learning more about better risk communication, flood risk communication and management. They are specially targeted at community leaders and decision makers working in floodplain management. Next slide, please. So the subject for the next 4 webinars in this series, including today, as you can see, is going to be flood risk management life cycle, or more specifically, the 4 stages which constitute a typical disaster management life cycle as they relate to flood risk. And webinar number 1 today will focus on the preparedness stage of the flood risk management life cycle, and in particular, the risk messaging aspect of it. So the 4 stages are preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. Each of the webinars in this series will cover those 4 stages. And webinar number 1 today will focus on, as I mentioned earlier, on the preparedness. So next slide, please. Here is the program for today's webinar. We will have 4 presentations from 3 agencies. A representative from 3 agencies will have those 4 presentations. Those agencies are engaged in various activities doing risk management. The Army Corps of Engineers, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and the California Department of Water Resources. Each agency's presentations will last about 15 minutes, and we'll have time for questions and answers afterwards. After the final presentation, we'll wrap up and conclude at 12:30. With that, I hand it over to Danae Olson from the Army Corps to get us started with the first presentation. Danae?
Great. Thank you so much, Samson. Good morning, everyone. My name is Danae Olson. I work with the Army Corps of Engineers out of the Sacramento District in the Flood Risk Management Program. And I'm here with my colleagues today, Sarah Moore and Patricia Fontanet Rodriguez, who is going to, both will be speaking here shortly. But I have the privilege to talk a little bit about Silver Jackets, which is the team that brings us here today. So next slide, please. So Silver Jackets teams are interagency teams that facilitate collaborative solutions to state flood risk priorities. The state-led teams bring together multiple state, federal, and sometimes tribal and local agencies to learn from one another and work together to reduce flood risk and sometimes other natural disasters. The first Silver Jackets team was formed in 2005 in Ohio, followed by the second Silver Jackets team that was formed in Indiana in 2006. And since that time, 54 Silver Jackets teams have formed all over the US in all 50 states, in addition to 3 territories and in the District of Columbia. And the name Silver Jackets, just to give a little history, came from
Sarah, I just got one.
when there is a disaster and you have several agencies who arrive to support communities. You have FEMA wearing a certain color, you have the Corps of Engineers wearing a certain color, Cal OES wearing a different color, and the concept behind the Silver Jacket is to have a kind of neutral or common color that all agencies are invited to wear together with, coming in with the collaborative spirit with the same common goal. So Silver Jackets projects are competitive projects. We have an annual proposal process, but we are constantly collecting ideas. If there are folks on the line today who hear about a project idea that you think would be a good fit for your community, we hope that you will reach out and see if we can do some brainstorming together and see if there's a project that we might be able to help your community with. The teams are state-led. So for the California Silver Jackets, we have the Department of Water Resources as the lead for Silver Jackets, and we say they are federally empowered. So the financing, it comes from, it's 100% federally funded, but the projects are built on partner in-kind contributions. So what that means is we may have, for example, Cal OES agreeing to contribute their time to attend meetings, to review developed outreach materials, to participate in webinars or to present at a workshop. It could be to help compile existing data if we're doing floodplain mapping or watershed assessments. So there's all sorts of different ways that the agencies who are participating partners can contribute. And the partners are at all levels. We love to work with locals, tribes. We have state partners and federal partners, work with counties and cities. So we love to bring everyone to the table. Next slide. Okay. And similar to kind of the larger theme of our webinar series that we're hosting here, similarly, the Silver Jackets projects work throughout the flood risk management life cycle and have project opportunities within all phases, all stages of the life cycle. So we have activities or projects like what we have here today for preparation and training, where there'll be information sharing, and you'll hear about some great tips and ideas for how to effectively communicate risks. There are project activities also under response and recovery and mitigation as well. And you can see a few pictures here of some floodplain management plans that have been developed for specific communities. Also watershed management plans and other types of kind of preliminary planning type of support. Next slide. So one of the great benefits of Silver Jackets and the projects that fall under the Silver Jackets program is what we like to call the collaboration continuum. So all the different entities start with their individual services and sectors and all the great resources that they all hold individually. And we all coexist and we're all self-reliant in many ways. But through Silver Jackets, we have this kind of encouraged communication and information sharing that happens, leading to cooperation and shared resources, shared subject matter experts, and kind of pooling of all the information that is out there. The coordination and collaboration leading to shared work. And the result is a partnership, which is a shared responsibility. And the great benefits of the partnership is having a collective impact, kind of a new and improved organization and services, and integrated in organization and services. And sometimes this is done through more than one project. Sometimes it takes multiple projects, and we are always collecting ideas for new projects and looking for opportunities to support communities through Silver Jackets. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ms. Sarah Moore to talk a little bit more about some specific examples of interagency projects that were developed by Silver Jackets teams. Thanks.
Hey, thank you very much, Danae. So yes, like Danae said, I'm going to give examples of interagency projects that your community could reach out to the California Silver Jackets to do in your own community to prepare for flood disasters. So if you go to the next slide. So one of the ways that a community can prepare for flood risk would be floodplain mapping and having a hazard assessment completed. The Silver Jackets can help a community prioritize areas, conduct floodplain inundation mapping of areas, update mapping, and help develop partnerships with other agencies that can help fund for opportunities to maybe mitigate whatever those flood risks are discovered during the mapping exercise and the hazard assessments. If you could go to the next slide. So here's an example of a community reached out to Silver Jackets, and you'll notice the red dotted line is what's considered a berm between that community and the river. And the Silver Jackets team came in and helped them figure out what a flood situation would look like in that community if the berm were to fail. And from there, I'll show you some other examples later on that this community continued to take with the Silver Jackets team. But this is just an example of something that Silver Jackets could help you with in your community. Next slide. So once you have an idea of what your flood risk may be, you may need to develop a new flood emergency action plan or update an existing emergency action plan. And Silver Jackets can help you accomplish that for your community. We actually have an emergency action plan guidebook that was developed by the Minnesota Silver Jackets team. And we help communities walk through that guidebook, or you can also find the guidebook. I will put the link for it in the chat. You can find it here at the bottom as well. And so if you can go to the next slide. A part of that EAP creation is helping helping communities develop emergency levels and understanding what different flood risk and flood emergencies look like in your community. So Silver Jackets can help the community come together and walk through that, figuring out this emergency level guidance. Next slide. The next part of that would be then creating your call trees. And so communities may already have call trees in place, and we can help update those or create new ones if you've maybe redone your emergency levels. So these are really important, and we always recommend if there's one thing that a community has, it has a call tree printed out up on the wall, ready to call the next person when there's a flood emergency. Next slide. So this is that same community that I showed at the beginning as an example that had the berm along the river. And we went further to help this community identify evacuation routes and critical infrastructure within that community. And this is something that we can help other communities with as well. It can become a part of their EAP, or it can just be a standalone piece of information that maybe they needed to have. Next slide. Once a community understands their flood risk, has developed their EAP, they may need to exercise it. And we always suggest holding a tabletop exercise. It's a great way to bring emergency managers together in a community, planners together in the community, your GIS people together, bring them together into one room and exercise your community's emergency response plan. We can create and incorporate real life challenges that you may be having. And you can also take these tabletop exercises and turn them actually into a workshop and have information exchange between participants that show up to the workshop. So the Silver Jackets program, where we really pride ourselves on being able to deliver top-notch tabletop exercises for communities, and we can deliver these either virtually, say if you have a really large area and it would be difficult to get people to come together, or we can also do them in person. So sit down at the emergency management office and hold a tabletop exercise in person. Next slide. I'm going to now ask my colleague Patricia to come on, and she's going to give a really great example of a tabletop exercise from the Tijuana River Watershed Binational Dam Safety tabletop exercise. And the reason why we wanted to highlight this is because we think it's really important to include all members of your community that may be a part of the emergency response. And sometimes those members of the community may not have English as their first language. And one of the things we're really priding ourselves on at the California Silver Jackets is the ability to hold bilingual tabletop exercises and to produce bilingual material that is flood risk messaging. And the examples that you're going to see here are all for Spanish. But of course, if your community has another language that may be the primary spoken language, we want to encourage you to consider holding tabletop exercises and relaying flood risk messaging in the language that is comfortable for your community to understand. So Patricia, if you want to hop on, I'll let you take over.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia Fontanet Rodriguez, and I was able to do the Spanish facilitation side of this tabletop exercise. So we're going to just dive a little bit deeper into how this played out. So this example is a bilingual tabletop exercise, and it was the first binational Silver Jackets project. So it did receive quite a bit of attention. To provide some context, the Tijuana River watershed covers both Mexico and the U.S. And a dam breach in the U.S., for example, would cause flood flows that would reach Mexico in under an hour. And you can see the Tijuana River watershed here in this picture. And the red line is the border boundary between the U.S. and Mexico. So you could see how flood flows could go down to Mexico, and then they would actually come back to the U.S. Based on how the watershed is made up. So the importance of this project, as Sarah mentioned, was to focus on bilingual communication, which is going to be critical, especially during emergencies where communication is super important and everything is happening really, really fast. Next slide. This bilingual tabletop exercise, we decided to hold it in both English and in Spanish. So this was a huge undertaking, but it was very much worth it. We had over 100 participants from 2 countries and a lot of engagement. This slide here is an example of how we drafted the slides in both languages. So they all look like this one. They had the content in English and then in Spanish. And so not only were the slides in both languages, but we were also speaking in both languages, and we had translators available for those who only spoke one language. So to give you guys an example of how the flow of the exercise was, I'm just going to repeat what I said in Spanish. Decidimos realizar el ejercicio tanto en inglés como en español. Fue un gran esfuerzo, pero valió la pena. Tuvimos más de 100 participantes de 2 países y con mucha participación. Este dispositivo que pueden ver es un ejemplo de cómo redactamos la presentación en ambos idiomas. Next slide. During the tabletop exercise, we presented 2 dam safety scenarios by showing a video for each scenario and then following up with a group discussion. So shortly, we will show you a sample of one of the scenario videos. Durante el ejercicio, presentamos 2 video escenarios sobre el tema de seguridad de represas que fue seguido por una discusión en grupo. Y ahora les mostraremos un ejemplo de uno de los video escenarios que utilizamos durante el ejercicio. So Sarah, if we can play the first video in English.
Southern California has been in a drought for many years. Last year, precipitation was above average, filling Barrett Dam to near pre-drought.
Okay. What's the video? I believe it's off for me.
Yeah, we only saw part of the video there, Sarah. I'm not sure if it went down.
Okay, did it not play?
For about 5 or 6 seconds.
Oh, okay. I will play the Spanish version longer. It may be lagging a little bit.
Sounds great.
Yeah, so we basically showed the videos in both English and in Spanish, and that's what we're trying to show you all here.
And give us just a minute to get the video pulled up. WebEx takes a minute to change gears here.
I guess while that's happening, so for the TTX, we used Zoom, which was the most comfortable application for the US and Mexico counterparts. And Zoom has the capability where you can have different rooms, and the different rooms can be in different languages. But we chose to keep everyone in the same room because it would not have been as valuable to have people in different rooms. Like, we wanted to be able to see each other's faces in the camera. We wanted to be able to hear each other's voices, even though we had to repeat everything in both languages. We believe the participation and the engagement was a lot more personal by having everyone together, even though the exercise took longer. So that's something to consider for bilingual exercises. And I think we are ready for the video. One, or at least get a sense of what the video was like. Awesome. Alrighty. So yeah, that was just a little snippet of how the table exercise went down. And I believe that is all I have to talk about in this exercise. Next slide. So that was the first video that we showed. And then next slide. Alrighty, I'll kick it back to Sarah. Thank you so much.
Hello, sorry about the technical difficulties. My computer decided to not play the videos anymore, which happens sometimes. So those were just quick examples of how we can create some really nice looking videos that play out a scenario for a community, and that's a free service if you choose to partner with the Silver Jackets and hold a tabletop exercise. Another part of preparing a community for flood emergencies or flood risk is education and outreach to your community. And we have lots of Silver Jackets projects where that's the focus of the project. Next slide. And part of that includes things like door hangers. And here we just wanted to show another example of using a bilingual resource to message risk messaging. Next slide. And then, of course, we can also create items that can be targeted towards children, because a lot of times what children learn in school, they take home and give to their parents and talk about it together with them. So this is just an example of a flood awareness coloring book and activity book for children, but you can create one in your own community. Next slide. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Danae to finish up quickly.
Yes. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Patricia. So just to mention a few other project ideas to kind of plant some seeds, and also we hope that you will bring these back to your communities and check out the great content that's inside. I'll put the links in the chat for these documents that were created through the California Silver Jackets. We have a technical Flood After Fire California toolkit that is a resource for technical specialists to assess flood and debris flow risk after a wildfire. And then also there is a guide that was put together for residents. Lots of great information on how to be better prepared before, during, and after a wildfire and the associated flooding that can happen after a wildfire. Next slide, please. Another great benefit of the Silver Jackets is support to the community rating system, which is under the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program. There are many communities across California who are participating in this community rating system, and communities often will have a floodplain manager or a CRS coordinator. Sometimes there is a relatively small shop who's helping to manage the activities that are given points that fall under this program. And so the Silver Jackets has had some great success stories in coming alongside those coordinators and supporting them to kind of up their outreach strategies and to help with some of the other categories that fall under CRS. And for the sake of time, we'll have to move on from here. Next slide, please. And for the last item I'm going to mention today is the planning studies and watershed assessments that Silver Jackets projects can offer. And these help to identify water resource problems and opportunities, determine measures and alternatives that could reduce these problems, and develop partnerships and identify opportunities to implement recommendations. So with that, if any of the items that you heard about here today are of interest to you and you'd like to learn more, if we could go to the next slide. We will add Rachel Oriana's contact information to the chat. She is our program manager at the Army Corps of Engineers Flood Risk Management Program. And yeah, we hope to hear from you. And I think with that, we can go ahead and turn it over to our next presenter for today. Thank you so much for your attention.
Good afternoon. Miranda, I will have you change the slides manually. Not dexterity. I don't have the dexterity right now. Good afternoon. My name is Frank Mansell. I'm with FEMA out of Region 9 in Oakland. And part of our area that we cover is Arizona, Nevada, California, and Hawaii, as well as the Pacific Islands. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about today is, of course, flood after fire. And I'll basically, you may have heard the Flood After Fire campaign. It's a banner that's carried by not only FEMA, but by the Corps of Engineers and by the Department of Water Resources. And I think in some areas, even the National Weather Service carries it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Actually, we're going to be talking a lot about that. And then we'll talk about preparing for the threats of floods after fire and floods generally, and all other emergencies. And just making sure that you pay attention to what's going on around you. Next slides, please. So wildfires have been in California. I think our slogan might be feast or famine. And when we're not feasting on wildfires, we have dry areas of drought, and that's obviously followed by flooding, as you can see. One of the expressions of FEMA is droughts are always followed by floods. And we're at the point where we are seeing that in spades right now. We've got one of the largest snowpacks ever recorded. We have high temperatures coming, and this combined with the fact that there are burn scars left from years and years of wildfires. It seemed like one wildfire seemed to surpass the other as far as being the most acreage, most damage, and the most residents displaced. it was one of those events where the slogan was California's burning. So what happens is the burn scars, and of course, following a wildfire, the fire actually scorches the earth to the point where it becomes impermeable to moisture and water. And we are faced right now with the situation where we have a good number of wildfire burn scars in the Sierra. And we are at the point where the combination of the multiple atmospheric rivers have already saturated the soil in the valley. We are now facing a snow melt or a melt of the snowpack. And I spent the last couple of days on many media calls where we are getting that flow occurring. So the campaign that FEMA embarked upon, and again, complements the programs that we see with the Corps of Engineers and EWR. If you go to the next slide, we can talk about that. The 2017 wildfires, the best example of flood after fire was the Thomas Fire in 2017. And in 3 weeks after the Thomas wildfire, we were in fact faced with massive amounts of rain and mud flows, particularly evident in the Santa Barbara area. And unfortunately, 23 lives were lost, and a good portion of that happened in just a matter of hours. So what we saw there was a demonstration that was very hard to ignore, in that the scarring of the soil just caused such a rapid runoff that it took boulders and houses and cars and just devastated that watershed. So we're finding that in that area, we actually have had the county of Santa Barbara and the city of Montecito had applied for a grant to, in fact, alleviate and help mitigate future flooding by purchasing land. A total of 8 homes were purchased, and the area was made into a debris basin, which helped and proved itself worthy in the floods that we saw in earlier this season. So that's an example of some of the activities that follow flood after fire. We have embarked annually since then on a campaign that includes some of the multimedia, social media events that you see on the illustration below. So we have involved and retained services to develop iPhone apps, iPhone advertising, editorials, and all sorts of paid advertising on the electronic side to promote the fact that you are at risk. You're at greater risk if you happen to be in an area that's been affected by wildfire. One of the main messages that we use is that flood insurance is one of the best ways to protect your greatest investment. For most of us, that is the investment in your house and your mortgage. So staying out of the flood insurance game is not always advisable, considering that there could be a mudslide in a watershed or in a burn scar area that doesn't result in a FEMA disaster declaration. A lot of individuals seem to count on the fact that they are going to recover fully with a FEMA disaster declaration, and that would be one of the furthest things from the truth. During a normal flood, you will find that about an inch of water is going to cost approximately $25,000 in damage by the time you replace the carpet, the floorboards, the drywall that has whipped up, the electrical behind that, the cupboards, the doors, all of the framing, and all that's at risk. So it's very expensive for even just a small amount of water, let alone what might come from mud. And if you don't protect yourself and you expect that a FEMA disaster declaration is going to help you, you perhaps should have another look, because all that FEMA can offer you, even for an uninsured individual, and FEMA does not pay or duplicate any benefits that you might have in insurance. So with that $25,000 staring at you for just an inch of water, and if you don't get a disaster declaration, that is on you as a homeowner. So flood insurance is a good way to get that coverage. That can either be through the National Flood Insurance Program, or it can be other sources. It doesn't have to be a National Flood Insurance Program policy that you have. So, and another thing that individuals don't realize is many folks, I'd say a majority moreover than not, believe that their current house insurance, homeowners insurance, covers floods, and it does not. So if you want to be practical about it, you must buy a flood insurance policy. And we're seeing an uptick in that just generally by the interest that we see on the media calls these last couple of days. So just know that you're at greater risk if you happen to be in a burn scar, and flood insurance is one of the best ways to protect yourself. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit more about preparedness. As much as we're going to see the snowpack melt and we're going to see this disaster evolve in real time almost, it's important for you to know that if you purchase flood insurance through the Flood Insurance, National Flood Insurance Program, there is a 30-day waiting period before that takes effect. So if you are talking to anyone, make sure that they purchase as soon as they can, and have them know that about 40% of the claims that we pay are for structures that are not in an identified flood zone. So just know that. So the best way to be prepared is to be aware of your surroundings, listen to your radio, listen to your first responders. They're the ones with the boots on the ground and can tell you the evacuation route, what the real risk is, and areas to avoid. One of the things that occurs during a flood is that people insist that they can cross a waterway that's got water running through it. 6 inches of water will carry your car away and you in it. So turn around, don't drown, listen to your first responders. There is a FEMA app that's both iOS friendly and Android friendly. It tells you and gives you the opportunity to prepare a go kit, what to look for shelters, and how to apply for FEMA for assistance following a disaster. It's a very good application for you to use. Another good source of information is ready.gov, and that's probably best accessed. It can be accessed on your phone, but if you access it on your laptop, there are lists and very, very good tips on how best to prepare. And one of those ways is to prepare yourself financially. Take photographs of your documents, inventory, take pictures of your possessions. If you can, take photos of the serial numbers, upload all that to the cloud, and then regardless of what happens, whether the flood affects you minimally or whether it takes away your filing cabinets, gets all your files wet, you've got a backup. And that's one of the worst things to watch as a first responder and a disaster responder, is to have people come to us and say, I don't have my insurance policy number, I don't have my license number, I don't have documents that I need to recover. If it's in the cloud, you can retrieve it. So be prepared. Know that you are at greater risk in and around burn scar areas. Know that not all flood areas identified are going to flood. They could well expand beyond what the flood maps say. So be prepared and know that floods always occur and will more likely be more disastrous if they're in and around the burn scar. I believe that's the last slide. Actually, this is the financial first aid kit that you can get. If you just type in emergency first aid kit, this will give you a very, very good start as to what you can do online, or you can order this in print. But it's a document that will carry you through and help you keep track of all the critical documents that you need post-disaster. And I believe that's it. I thank you very much for your time, and I'll take any questions on the chat, I suppose.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Frank. All right. And next up, we have Mr. Mike Mearswa with the California Department of Water Resources.
Howdy, everybody, and good afternoon. I'm going to try and get us done here during your lunch break before you have to get back to some other things. I'm going to cut across all 4 cycles of our flood risk management life cycle here. I'll talk quite a bit about preparation. I'm going to blend the mitigation in there because mitigation is something we can do in preparation. And then I will also be talking about some of the response and recovery actions that have been happening. And I'm going to be doing this all in the context of the storms that we've been having in this winter here. The slide you're looking at here to start off with is a picture of a mussel wall that was installed on the Pajaro River in Monterey County back in January 2023. And what you can see here is that is the Pajaro River off on the left-hand side picture there. And you can see the water is rising up to the top of literally the mussel wall there and the fence system that we put out there. You can see that there's some water that's gotten through the defense system there. It's to hold out the majority of the water. It's not a foolproof system like any defense system. I kind of think water like rats. The water's going to get where it's going to get. Our job is basically to prevent the major damage out there. If you go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about, in the context of these storms, the hazard that came through, our response. I'll get into the consequences, both the DR 4683 and the DR 4699. When Frank was talking about the Thomas fires back in 2017 in context, that was DR 4353. So across the United States, we've had a couple hundred of these major presidential declared disasters in the past several years. I'm going to then have a slide that'll talk about the disaster cycles and where all this fits in, and then get to what can we do about this in mitigation actions. The picture you're looking at is yet another part of the state of California where we had flooding. This is Merced County in the city of Merced along Bear Creek. This was also in those January 2023 storms. Next slide, please. So the hazard, we had a series of 9 atmospheric rivers that came through the end of December, beginning of January 2023. One of these was exceptional, 4 were moderate, and 4 were in the middle there, strong. In comparison, in water years 2020 and 2021, we only had 3 strong atmospheric rivers. The scale here is what I'm depicting in the graphic here of 1, which is a weak atmospheric river, a moderate is like a level 2, strong is a level 3 atmospheric river, extreme atmospheric rivers, which we did not have, would be considered pink in this scale. And then we did have, to start everything off here on December 27th, an exceptional atmospheric river come through. You can learn more about atmospheric rivers through the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes. There's a lot of good videos on that, but that's really our hazard and driver. If you could go to the next slide, please. Out of just the January storms, and I haven't talked about what happened in March yet, we had an extreme 20-day cumulative rainfall totals out here. This graphic depicts rainfall totals across the state. You can see in the higher elevation areas of the coastal range and the Sierra Nevada. that we were having precipitation totals for 1 month over 30 inches in some locations. We have one location there of 47.74 inches located near Honeydew, California. This is a phenomenal amount, and for those of you who have been following the news about the atmospheric river, the Arc Storm 2.0 scenario, Daniel Swain likes to describe basically as what we had as a half of an arc storm, which brings some credibility to the work that Daniel and his research group have been doing out there. And it's the type of thing that we need to be looking into the future. Go to the next slide, please. Our response. Well, one of the things we do is California has the National Weather Service's California Nevada River Forecast Center. You're looking at a graphic of the official forecast points in California, Nevada. You can see here that nearly half of these locations during the January storms exceeded what the Weather Service in this region defines as a monitor stage, which is where we start having concern. Those are those orange dots that you're seeing in the map. You can see a many number locations are also hitting what they call flood stage. In this particular depiction, this snapshot didn't show any of these locations at danger stage, but we have had some danger stage out there. In response, these forecasts coming from the Weather Service are used to do things such as advanced evacuations and pre-positioning of emergency responders, aka the assets. Some of the teams that were using this information, Caltrans, we had swift water rescue teams, EMTs were being placed across the state in January. The air resources from the National Guard were being put in place to do airlifts if we needed. And then Cal OES, State Operations Center, had a full GIS mapping team as part of the first time we've done advanced planning as part of an event, knowing that there were going to be future atmospheric rivers from our forecasts coming in. We were looking not just at what was going to be happening in the next 24 to 48 hours, but we were looking a week plus out to also position these materials, make sure we weren't having fatigue, and allow basically the federal government and the state government to provide the resources for local agencies to get through what was going to be a really difficult time period. If you go to the next slide, please. In the watershed response, this is physically what happened out here. We had across the state 8 stage records that broke the previous records out here. I'm not going to read each of these, but this gives you a sense of just how significant basically these series of storms were coming out here. And these storms weren't discriminating and just picking on one part of the state. They were hitting the entire state. And so you can see in the table here that I have examples from Merced going all the way to Ventura County. So it was quite a phenomenal test of our emergency responsibility. Next slide, please. Our response as we start getting into the recovery and the mitigation phases of our flood risk management cycle, we ended up calling this event DR 4683. So on January 4th, Governor Newsom proclaimed a statewide emergency, which mobilized some of those resources I talked about. It created and opened up the State Operations Center at Cal OES. At the Department of Water Resources, we opened up the Flood Operations Center, and public utilities were also setting up their emergency operations centers. Federal agencies that joined us at the State Operations Center and the Flood Operations Center included FEMA, the U.S. Coast Guard, the USGS, NOAA, NASA, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Air Force. Private sector and NGOs such as the American Red Cross in Esri, who is our GIS wizards, they were coming in providing free resources to the state during this. And all of this was driven on looking at the forecast, what would be happening in the next 24 hours out to, again, as I pointed out, the next couple of weeks. By January 14th, President Biden declared the major disaster, and the code that we use is we call it DRs, and it was the DR 4683, and it had a name as the California Severe Winter Storms, Flooding, Landslides, and Mudslides. The graphic you're looking at on the right is what came out after that. In beginning of March, so the end of February, Cal OES, DWR, and FEMA produced what we call a joint hazard mitigation strategy for the major presidential disaster. And this is required by the Stafford Act of 1988. And the importance of these hazard mitigation strategies, these become the blueprints that create the guidelines for future funding to prevent disasters like this from happening again. So we go through, we look at what's happening during the event, we start describing where we see some losses, and we start developing high-level strategies of what we can collectively do to mitigate a future event like this. And this will come up again in my slides. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the state going back to the 4683, where you can see basically the counties that had eligible, what we call individual assistance or public assistance. And these are important terms of art. Individual assistance, when I looked at this last Friday, it was over $40 million in approved claims. That number has crept up over the weekend to like $42 million. Individual assistance includes private structure losses or temporary relocation costs, such as housing. So if you had to evacuate and you were having to stay in a hotel, you could apply to get individual assistance. Frank was messaging about the importance of flood insurance because individual assistance is pretty minimal on what you can get. So you need to take at your own level other actions to go through and financially protect yourself so you can recover from flood loss. Public assistance is also important as part of the formula of what you can later get as a state or community for mitigation. And public assistance includes the replacement costs for any public facility. So a levee, a flood wall, or a dam, if those are damaged, you can get those costs reimbursed. Debris basins, we had a lot of debris basins that were 100% full down in Santa Barbara County. I believe Ventura might have had a few, and San Luis Obispo as well, but it was really Santa Barbara in the January events where the debris basins got full. The cost for removing that debris that's in the basins can be covered under public assistance. Water treatment plants, wastewater treatment plants, other public utilities, all of these critical lifeline services, when they're damaged in an event, you can later go to FEMA to get reimbursement, and we calculate that. So if you go to the next slide, hold that thought, I'll get back to that calculation out there. But now I'm going to jump forward. February was pretty calm, and in March, then we had another series of 3 atmospheric rivers come through the state. These atmospheric rivers were kind of following the same track. They came through the Coast Range and the northern end of the transverse range of the Sierra Nevada. So they were basically hitting, again, San Luis Obispo County, Tulare, Kings County, Kern, Fresno County. They clipped a little bit of Madera County. Newsom again proclaimed another statewide emergency on March 1st. By April 3rd of 2023, President Biden declared another major disaster, and the State Operations Center was reopened again. This time, CAL FIRE established an incident command post down in Visalia, which is what you're looking at, the old Tulare Lake bed in this map here. What you can't see in this screenshot that I have, because it's really tiny, the National Weather Service goes through and forecasts when you're going to have the peak runoff due to snowmelt. So a lot of these storms that were coming both in January and March were very cold, and the flooding could have been much worse in a climate change world where we could have had more direct response from the watersheds. But most of this was trapped in snow, so now we had record snowpacks in the southern Sierra Nevada. And those graphics are showing that at the end of April, beginning of May, was when the Weather Service was predicting we were going to have our peak runoff coming from the snow melt in these areas. So a lot of people think, hey, it's sunny outside, it's not raining, the flood risk is over. Well, not in some parts of the state. And this is an area of the state where we are still activated at our State Federal Flood Operations Center, where we have our own advanced planning unit that has been going through and developing maps to share with emergency responders where we expect the inundation to be. And we're holding weekly reservoir coordination calls. And those little dots that you see on the map there, again, those are where those reservoirs, the major flood control reservoirs are. And we're trying to manage that. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what's happened now as we move from a storm-based flood emergency response to a slow rise flood response, which is really important in how you develop your mitigation strategies. It's slightly different. Next slide, please. So again, looking at the counties that were impacted by the March storms, these counties all had individual assistance that I described before, or public assistance, or both. The individual assistance, when I looked on Friday, was $4 million. It's $5 million now. So over the weekend, we calculated another $5 million of impacts to Californians. And some of the counties aren't actually included in here right now for the public assistance. I think that'll change. You can see out there that in the map, I misspoke. Individual assistance, Kings and Fresno County didn't have individual assistance, but I think that as this slow flooding occurs due to the snowmelt, that we'll begin to see some individual assistance claims come out here. So I expect this graphic here to be revised by the end of this month. And the nature, as I indicated, of this disaster declaration is very different than what happened here in January, and that this is about the slow rise of flooding. And these are in areas where we've had groundwater subsidence, which means some of our previous maps and tools and land use is a little older. And yeah, Janae asked a question, disaster relief. I don't know, actually. It's a good question. Maybe Frank knows. We just call them DRs, but they're triggered by the major disaster declarations. Yeah, Janae, I suspect it's probably recovery. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a graphic that I pulled together in January to explain things to people. Is before disaster occurs, we have a lot of time. We have decades to months before disaster to prepare for it. And part of our preparedness kit is to take these mitigation measures. And these can be, we can go through and do assessments to understand where the future risk is at. We can go through and do capacity building activities, which is what Silver Jackets promotes. We can go through and implement. We can do things on the ground, or we can raise our buildings. But I showed all those mitigation in these 3 separate tracks, because often we go to the things that are construction related, those implementation activities. But one of my cohorts, Jeremy Hill, he likes to say, meet a friend before you need a friend. And so the capacity building is often getting to know the people who in an emergency, in a response time, you're going to be working with. That really makes it to where you can skip sort of that first date and get into an actual true response mode quickly. And then the assessment activities. The maps might not be perfect, but having gone through and come up with a floodplain map that similar to what the Army Corps team was showing us earlier out there, that allows you to also skip that first step and move to square 2 out there. When you're in the response, different responses have different natures. Sometimes the response can be just days long. As we saw in January, we had weeks. We knew that by looking at satellite data and temperature data in the ocean, we could actually see that there were going to be more atmospheric rivers after the first 2 came through California. And so we stood up the State Operations Center knowing that we would be activated through the entire month of January. But we also knew those storms were going to be cold. So there are parts of the states that we weren't as worried about because we had the rainfall was going to come as, or the precipitation was going to come as snow, not rainfall, and stay up there until later this spring. But as the March storms came in, we knew that that snow melt period was much closer. So when we activated in March, we did so knowing that we would be continuously activated through the months of April and May as well. So those weeks are starting to stretch into months for the DR 4699 for the March storms. What happens also out here is parallel, we start moving into recovery. You can start going through and doing your preliminary damage assessments, the PDAs, to go through and see areas that were damaged initially. And that's some of the data that I was showing with you that was used to develop the joint hazard mitigation strategy based off of the individual assistance and the public assistance. And that's really important because the amount of damage you have during the event determines how much money that the federal government will be providing to the state to go through and use to mitigate future losses like that. And then concurrent to moving into a mitigation cycle, you will also get into the recovery, which is repair and rehabilitation of all of those public facilities that I had mentioned out there. And that could take months and then sometimes 2 to 3 years. And I have an important footnote there is technically FEMA public assistance recovery project should only take 18 months. But when you start getting into some of the Army Corps levy systems out there, sometimes working through programs like Public Law 8499, that can take about 3 years. And the state has some of its own programs that take about 2 to 3 years on some of those larger construction projects. Next slide, please. So flood mitigation activities, I kind of talked about this. In mitigation, often we're moving water away from people or we're moving people away from water. And then you can get into a lot of large scale construction and land use activities. When you get into response, and this is where people don't understand things, you at this point in time are pretty much limited to keeping people away from water. That's why you hear a lot more about evacuations and response. You can't build a dam overnight. You can't build a levee overnight. You really can't raise a large building overnight. These are things you can do really well in mitigation preparedness, but in response, your options become very limited, which is why preparedness and mitigation are so important. Recovery housing requires highly specialized support services. Not everyone can go through and do the care and feeding and sheltering of people who have been relocated. Flood insurance is one of the quickest ways to get economic recovery, and Frank talked about that. And the rehabilitation and repair costs can be costly, but sometimes they also offer new opportunities for improvements as well. And the federal government has been changing some of its rules when you're doing repair and rehabilitation to allow you to go through and incorporate some science to go through and do improvements and rethink things, which I think is really important for us to keep promoting that type of mix of recovery and mitigation, kind of really recognizing the cycle all blends together. Next slide, please. I know I'm running out of time. I just wanted to say that there's some examples of the type of mitigation activities you can do. Some of these came from one of my favorite groups. It's the Federal Interagency Floodplain Management Task Force. The FIFM-TIF is the acronym that we use for it. They last met in 1994. If you go to the next slide, I'm not going to walk through the details on it, but they have a series of 4 high-level strategies with examples of actions where you can modify the human susceptibility to flood damage. You can modify the impact of flooding on individuals and community. You can modify the floods themselves, or you can preserve and restore the natural resources and functions of floodplains. And there's some overlap in the type of actions, but in general, these are actions the state and the federal government, when we see projects that do these things, that we are very supportive of. If you go to the next slide out here, I'm going to talk just a couple more slides now on, okay, how do you get into mitigation? Well, any disaster triggers a hazard mitigation grant program, an HMGP. It is established first by this joint hazard mitigation strategy. And then the amount of funding that comes into the HMGP grants. So there's going to be 2. There's an HMGP associated with the DR 4683, and there'll be another one associated with the DR 4699, so the January and March events. The formula is for states that have an enhanced state hazard mitigation plan, which California does, you get 20% of your total individual plus public assistance dollars, roughly. And if you don't have enhanced status, then it's 15%. The point being is the more costly disaster, the more money that's going to be available for future hazard mitigation. And then some key points is out here is that these hazard mitigation grant programs and the state hazard mitigation plan, they're led by Cal OES. The state hazard mitigation plan here in California, as I indicated, is enhanced status, so we get more money. And this is money for communities. These go down to cities and counties. The state can apply too, but this is really money for most of you at the local level. And Cal OES and DWR, what we need is that you need to have a local hazard mitigation plan that is approved by Cal OES and FEMA to be eligible for these funds. Not everyone has this, so it's really important that in your preparedness activities that you keep your plans current and active so that when these funding opportunities come up, you can be eligible. And these hazard mitigation grant programs, they're only eligible to communities in California. We're not competing with any other states. And often we actually leave money behind, which really shouldn't be happening at all. We should be using every last cent that's available to us. If you go to the next slide. Okay, so March 1st, for the January storms, Cal OES released the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and it officially opened where there could be consultation with Cal OES starting March 31st. They really wanted to get the money out fast to prevent future losses. May 10th, which is coming up just in a couple weeks, are when you have to provide a notice of interest back to Cal OES. So this is like a pre-application. It's a short letter saying that, yes, we are interested in applying by August 4th of 2023 to have a sub-application to Cal OES to get one of these hazard mitigation grants. The way these work is there's 75% federal cost share, 25% non-federal cost share. If you have a grant with a state agency, we're often very flexible. I know at the department we are, where we allow you to use our money as that non-federal cost share. We know that there's front costs that you have to take to apply for these. And the department and Cal OES would be happy between now and May to talk to you if you have a project idea that you'd like to do. If you go to the next slide, I'll talk about the types of projects that you can actually get funded from this. And this is straight from the Notice of Funding Opportunities from CalUS. Is you can go through and get money to go through and update your hazard mitigation plans. So it's a small amount of money, but this is a lot of work. The money's there for that. You can do planning related activities. That's that know a friend before you need a friend type of activity. Project construction work. That's where most of the money is intended to be in these applications. But there is a type called advanced assistance where if you're not ready to get a project right now, you can use money to develop a project for the next cycle of either the HMGP grants, which we know there always will be, or the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grants, which are an annual grant that come around every September each year. And then this last thing is called a 5% initiative. This is more where government entities go into. This is where we enhance our data, our research, our building codes to come up with updated maps that then feed into the planning related project and advanced assistance categories. And again, everybody who's applying must have an active hazard mitigation plan. So that's the first showstopper. So if you don't have a hazard mitigation plan, use this to get a planning grant to get one. I think there'll be an exception for that. If you go to, I think I might have one more slide, which is my contact info. Again, my name is Michael Mearswell. I'm the State Floodplain Manager at the Department of Water Resources. And I did see in the chat that there was like a request to go back a couple slides. And it was, I think, to the PA. Where did we see it? Let me go back up to this one, to the task force. So I think there's a question here from Elizabeth that I see in the chat. I wanted us to go back to the FIFMTIF, the Federal Interagency Floodplain Management Task Force. The document and report they have is called the Unified National Program. This is actually legislated by Congress back in 1968 and is tied to the National Flood Insurance Act, the National Flood Insurance Program. So Frank could speak to this too from FEMA. But what happens is periodically Congress provides funding and brings together experts from federal agencies to form this task force to update this strategic blueprint of how we should manage floodplains in the United States. And the intent is that this recommendation set is then used by all federal agencies to prioritize their investments, which was that next slide that I showed those strategies. So I will call it in here and leave questions for the chat or for the facilitation team. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. Okay, and with that, we'll turn it back to Mr. Sampson. Do we have you with us, Sampson?
Yes, so this concludes our webinar for today. And I see a very vibrant conversation going on in the chat. Thank you, Danae and Nikki, for responding to those. We're running out of time. So in closing, I'd just like to add a couple of points here. So the concepts of flood risk management can be applied to any community that deals with management of hazards or disasters. The topic that we covered today, preparedness, allows communities to anticipate types of disasters likely to affect them in planning for emergency response, for example, or emergency action planning. As Danae mentioned earlier on, communities identify natural disaster risks and vulnerabilities that are unique to their area and put together actions and measures that will not only be applied during emergency, but also set in place conditions for recovery and rehabilitation. And similarly, in hazard mitigation planning, as Mike touched on, preparedness allows those same communities to think of ways to reduce the impact of disasters or ways to prevent disasters altogether, reducing or minimizing loss of life and property. And finally, I'd leave you with this quote from FEMA. Let me see if we have it on the chat. So yes, there it is. So disasters do not appear one day, just appear one day. They exist throughout time and have a life cycle of occurrence. This cycle is matched by a series of management phases. Establish strategies to mitigate hazards, prepare for and respond to emergencies, and recover from effects. Next slide, please. So the next in this series of webinars, webinar number 2, we haven't set the scheduled date yet, but it'll be focusing on response phase of risk management. Again, as Danae pointed out earlier, if you think of a silver jacket project that might be a good fit for your community, or if you have some ideas for a potential project, please contact the Silver Jackets lead coordinator, Rachel Oriana. Her contact email was posted earlier, but you can also post it again. And yeah, there it is. So again, I would like to thank all the presenters, also everyone who attended today's webinar, and hope to see you again in the next webinar. Bye, everybody. Thank you.